All right, so it's 8 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. Well, I'm truly delighted to have Dr. Emily Zeitler join us for Cardiology Grand Rounds this morning. Dr. Zeitler is a very close friend and colleague for, I think, over 12 years now. It's a pleasure to hear her speak on FDA device regulation. To give you some background, Emily is a native of North Carolina. She graduated from Duke University with a degree in health policy, after which, and she graduated magna cum laude, after which she spent some time in Washington, D.C. working on medical device approval and Medicare and Medicaid. Following that, she went to Emory for medical school, and then I had the privilege of working alongside her during residency at Mass General. After she graduated from residency, she actually took time out to do a dedicated fellowship at the FDA to work on specifically cardiovascular medical device regulation. She subsequently went down to Duke to do a cardiology fellowship, a clinical research fellowship at the Duke Clinical Research Institute, as well as electrophysiology fellowship. And she joined the faculty at Dartmouth as part of the Dartmouth Institute, as well as the Geisel School of Medicine back in 2018 as an assistant professor. So Emily, welcome. I'm sorry we can't host you in person, but thank you so much for graciously agreeing to do this virtually. If folks have questions, please feel free to send them in via the chat and I'll read them out at the end. So thank you very much, Emily.
Thanks, Arthi. I'm just so delighted and flattered and honored to have been asked to do this, especially by a good friend like you. So I really am so glad to be here, virtual or not. And it's even more exciting because I get to talk about the thing that I think is so fascinating. I suspect that many of you don't think about this topic very much. And so I hope it's maybe a bit of a respite from the things you're doing day to day in these crazy times. And I hope that you will send me questions, reach out to me either during this hour or afterwards. Please do so. I really would love to talk about this offline or find ways to collaborate. I know there are a number of folks at the BI who do think about these ideas and have been mentors and role models of mine, and so I look forward to ongoing collaboration and communication for many years to come. So thank you very much. The title of my talk is FDA Device Regulation at the Intersection of Safety and Innovation, and I'm going to take us all on a little journey through this intersection. I don't have any relevant industry disclosures. I am a special government employee of the FDA, which means they periodically pay me to do things, but no industry-related disclosures. At the conclusion of my talk, I hope that you'll be able to identify and recognize some of the salient features of medical device regulation, both on its own and in comparison to other regulated areas. And within that, to understand some of the potential conflicts that are raised in the regulatory ecosystem that can sometimes put the fostering of innovation in conflict with the protection of the public health safety. And then also within that, understanding how the medical device surveillance system, both in the pre and post market spaces, can emphasize that conflict between safety and innovation. I'm going to start with a case, and this is a case of a patient that I saw when I was a fellow, and it's a woman who has non-ischemic cardiomyopathy with a severely reduced left ventricular ejection fraction. At the time, she was on what we would consider optimal medical therapy with beta blocker and ACE inhibitor. She continued to have class 2 symptoms, but no history of VT or VF. So she was seen in 2005 and underwent implantation of a dual chamber ICD with a Riata ICD lead. This is a specific model of ICD lead. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it has a pretty storied history, and I'm going to get into it a bit more momentarily. And that was the device that was chosen at the time. 8 years later, she was presented to the emergency department for repeated inappropriate shocks from her device. She was noted to be in sinus rhythm, incidentally noted to have a left bundle branch block. And these shocks were notable because on fluoroscopic imaging of her lead, it was noted that the conductor cables had externalized through the insulation of the lead. At the time, this was a well-known mechanism for failure of the device, but was novel in the sense that other leads had not failed in this way before. At the time of this presentation, she underwent upgrade of her device to a CRT-D with a new right ventricular lead implanted. The old Riata lead was capped and abandoned, and she got a new right ventricular lead. Unfortunately, a few years later, when I met her, she came back. We detected that through remote monitoring that her new right ventricular lead had fractured and was no longer reliable. So she has really, unfortunately, had a lot of trouble with her implanted devices, and you might think that these devices had failed her more than helped her. And so we were faced with the decision of what do we do next? Both, more practically, what do we do with this patient in front of us? What do we do with her device? But also, how did the regulatory system perhaps fail her in this case? Before I try and answer that, I just want to highlight a couple of things. Many people have some familiarity with the way drugs are regulated in this country, and there are some parallels with the way devices are regulated, but there are some important differences. And the trajectory of device regulation in this country is reflective of some of these important differences. I've listed a few of them here, and I'm just going to mention a couple. First and foremost, the way that devices are studied in clinical trials differs substantially from the way drugs are studied. And one reason is because performing a placebo-controlled trial of a device can be very challenging. In many cases, it requires a sham procedure, either for implanted devices or procedures that are device-based. And sham procedures can be incredibly powerful when done correctly, but they pose real challenges with regard to logistics, and even there are ethical concerns that cannot be overcome in some cases. So this is a real issue with performing clinical trials of devices. A second thing I'll mention is that unlike drugs, devices are developed iteratively. So a small change on a device that really there may be no expectation that it would change the way the device functions, and a lot of iterative changes over the lifespan of the device may at some point add up to the device being a new device that may require another clinical trial or other sort of regulatory investigation. But knowing where to draw that line can be really challenging. This is sometimes called device creep, that small changes over time, one device becomes another, and identifying that threshold can be really challenging both for industry and for regulators, as well as operators and patients. So these are just some of the reasons why the device regulation has evolved in a way very different from drugs. And for the history buffs, I promise I won't torture this, but I think there are a couple of things that are interesting and relevant about the history of device regulation, and it really is based on these differences between drugs and devices, which have been recognized for a long time. Medical devices really weren't brought into the fold of systematic and universal regulation until the 1970s. Drugs and foods and drugs were regulated as early as the early 1900s, but it was really a generation or two later when devices were recognized as needing regulation as well. And then it wasn't really until another generation later in the late 90s that the idea of the least burdensome approach was established. I'm going to talk a little bit more about least burdensome approach in a moment, but the important thing here is that there was a recognition by FDA and industry that the demonstration of safety and effectiveness, which is the regulatory threshold for medical devices, that should be established through the least burdensome approach. The most efficient use of resources should be used to establish that. It obviously is a vague idea with a lot of flexibility, and it can the threshold for that can move up and down. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but it's an important principle behind medical device regulation. In 2002, user fees were established. This requires that the device industry pay a fee when an application is submitted for regulatory evaluation. These are administered on a sliding scale of sorts, with the understanding that not all medical device companies are created equal, and the user fees are established for a few reasons. Number one, it really requires that the industry have some skin in the game. So it reduces the frivolous applications that can gum up the gears of the regulators and can help them focus resources where they're needed most. Second of all, this does protect the device regulation system from some of the ebbs and flows of congressionally established budgets. So when there's a budget shutdown, device regulation can keep the lights on, and there's certainly impact, but for example, clinical trials that are being conducted for purposes of device regulation can continue, and the oversight of those clinical trials can continue based partially on these user fees. And the last thing I'll mention is the 21st Century Cures, which was passed in 2016, and this legislation really recognized some of the trends in our ability to manage data sets from real world evidence and ways to incorporate different kinds of data into the regulatory ecosystem. Not only real world data, but even anecdotal data was identified as a potential source of data for device regulation. Another important component of this legislation was a recognition that in disease states where there are no alternatives or very few alternatives, or the consequences of the disease state are particularly severe, that the regulatory threshold can be moved up or down based on that. So many components of this legislation have not yet been operationalized, so it remains to be seen how this unfolds in its entirety, but there have been some ripple effects in the regulatory ecosystem, and I'll mention a few of those as we go. Okay, with the history lesson behind us, one more thing about medical devices that's worth noting, and especially because it differs from drugs, is that medical devices are regulated based on risk. So lowest risk devices are really not a part of what I want to talk about today, toothbrushes and Band-Aids, but class 2 and class 3 devices, which require, generally speaking, require some sort of investigation before approval. These are the devices we generally think about when we think about medical devices, with class 3 devices being the highest risk devices. These are life-sustaining devices, implantable devices like ICDs, ablation catheters, and cardiac valves. The least burdensome approach, I mentioned this as part of the legislation in the late 90s, which established the threshold for establishing safety and effectiveness for medical device evaluation. And I mentioned that this is vague, and indeed it is. The requirements can be moved up or down depending on the scenario. So when things go wrong, for example, in the case of AEDs, which were initially regulated as a class 2 device, there were problems recognized in the clinical use of AEDs. And so the entire class of devices was moved up to a class 3 to improve the FDA's ability to surveil AEDs and provide oversight. In the opposite example, if the stakes are higher, like in the case of COVID-19, then the threshold for demonstrating safety and effectiveness may be lowered. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So in the era of COVID-19, there is the ability of the FDA to use the emergency use authorization, which allows medical devices to be approved with less rigorous data than would typically be the case. There have been both diagnostic and therapeutic devices approved under the emergency use authorization during the current pandemic. I've put some pictures of a couple of these, which I found were most interesting. I don't know what you guys are doing. We're not using these devices at my institution. They look pretty complicated, but this one on the right is called the lung pacer, and it is a device that paces the diaphragm to try and enable weaning from mechanical ventilation in patients who've been ventilated for a long time. Seems to make sense. Again, I've never seen it in use. This device, interestingly, was approved as part of the expedited access pathway back in 2016, and so it looks like this company is continuing to look for a home for this device. And I think if medical device companies are smart in the setting of COVID-19, if they're smart and efficient and can collect useful data during this window of opportunity, it may help move their devices through the regulatory system once the crisis has passed. But it remains to be seen what happens with these emergency use approvals once the emergency has passed. And then there are a number of already approved devices or cleared devices that might find a new home in the setting of COVID-19. The one that came to mind for me is this picture on the right. It's a screenshot of a artificial intelligence-based device made by a company called Caption Health, where there is an AI programming that allows novice sonographers to obtain high-quality echo images. The AI tells the user how to tilt or turn the probe in order to obtain high quality echo images. So I'm envisioning somebody, a nurse perhaps, going into a COVID-19 room in all of his or her appropriate PPE, obtaining an ECG to monitor for QTC, obtaining some labs, delivering medications, and then maybe obtaining echo images with the guidance of this AI. There are some other examples. Right now we're using Zoom to have this discussion this morning, and I think there are a lot of opportunities for these virtual meeting platforms to be enhanced for use in the medical field after the pandemic has passed, and so many other implications. I'm excited to see what happens, and I hope that these opportunities are capitalized on. Okay, so after that little jaunt through the history and basics of medical device evaluation, I want to put on my devil's advocate hat and argue both sides of a coin. On the one hand, I'm going to argue that in the attempt to balance safety with innovation in medical device regulation, I'm going to argue that the balance has shifted too far in favor of innovation at the expense of safety. And I think the case that I presented is a good example of that. So the Riata lead, which I mentioned at the beginning, was a ICD lead approved in the early 2000s. And it was approved as a supplement to a lead that was originally approved in the 1990s. So one could argue that this is an example of device creep. Like I mentioned before, that small iterative changes to a device, at some point a line was crossed and this became a new device, but it wasn't recognized as a new device. And so this lead was approved with no clinical testing submitted. The novel failure mechanism, which I mentioned, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment, was reported voluntarily in the literature as case reports by users in the field, and then ultimately by the manufacturer, who was also receiving reports of this, and through return product evaluation. Based on these reports, the FDA issued a Class 1 recall, which is the most serious type of recall. This was issued in 2011. I happened to be working at the FDA when this happened, and I can tell you that there was a lot of hand-wringing going on about what to say in this recall notice, because nobody really knew what was going on. Nobody really had any idea about how to monitor for this problem or how to solve it. And so based on the best evidence at the time, the recommendation was to perform routine surveillance with fluoroscopy or chest x-ray as part of this recall notice in all patients with a Riata lead in situ. And here's that picture I promised of the cable externalization problem. The red arrow is pointing at an area where the blue conductor cables have been externalized through the outer insulation of the lead, and this causes electrical failure, which can cause failure of pacing and sensing, but also of delivery of tachycardia therapies. Because, as I mentioned, because there was no prospective, systematic monitoring of this lead, or any device for that matter, it was really unknown what the rate of failure was for this lead. And thankfully, there were a number of institutions and systems that took the FDA's advice to heart and performed systematic imaging surveillance of patients with Riata leads in situ. The problem was there was all kinds of reports all over the literature about what those rates were, and understanding what the rate was important for understanding how to manage these patients. So along with some colleagues, we performed a meta-analysis of all these reports. This is a lot of information on this slide, but I can tell you that the rate of cable externalization reported in this in the literature and summarized in this meta-analysis was about 1 out of 4. So a quarter of leads that were surveilled were demonstrating this cable externalization problem, which far exceeded what was reported both by the manufacturer and what was understood to be the case by the regulators. And perhaps even more important was that the rate of electrical failure was 6%, which is far in excess of what is acceptable for, or what was acceptable for an ICD lead at that time, or this time, or any other. Importantly, that electrical failure was seen with and without the presence of cable externalization. So this lead had a lot of problems, none of which were recognized before it was brought to market, because there was no clinical testing, and wasn't recognized early on after it was brought to market because there was no systematic evaluation of this device or any other. And you'll notice in the bottom right corner that this meta-analysis was published in 2015, a full 4 years after the recall. So more than 4 years since this problem was recognized. And that's a long time. That's a lot of patients, and who knows what could have been avoided had we known something sooner. Now, the FDA did exercise its ability to compel the device company that made this lead to perform a post-approval or a post-market study called a 522 study. But in the red box in the bottom middle of the screen, you'll see that the final report from that study was just published, submitted earlier this year. This study enrolled around 1,000 patients and took 6 years to complete. And one could argue that it's really not meaningful anymore. And it was conducted in the traditional format of a clinical trial with CRFs and site visits and all of that, which is expensive and inefficient. And as you can see, it took many years to get any useful information. And in addition, once we knew the information about the rate of failure, what to do about it remained really unclear. We performed a decision analysis, and I won't torture this either. I'll tell you that between lead abandonment and lead extraction for a Riata lead, there really was no difference between the two strategies. What was still unknown is whether the lead should be revised at all. And there are a number of groups that have attempted to answer that. And I think the jury is still out on this lead or any other lead that's demonstrated to be have a high rate of lead failure. We still really don't know how to counsel patients about a Riata lead in situ. And I know I've spent a lot of time talking about this particular lead, but I think it's a good example of all of the effort and time that it took to discover information about this lead that one could argue should have been known well in advance of being implanted in a person, or certainly should have had mechanisms in place to learn about the lead in real time, not 4, 5, 6 years later. And this may be an explanation for why that's the case. I don't intend to read all of this text, but I can summarize it by saying that a number of people have looked into the quality of the data that support device evaluations, both for clearance and approval by the FDA. And in summary, the data might surprise you that it is not all high quality. In fact, some of it is very low quality and short and small, and these are not things that we generally associate with high quality data. So, there's a lot of room for improvement in the quality of the data that support device evaluation. The other summary point from the slide in the bottom right corner, you'll see that all of these were published in JAMA or JAMA IM. So if you would like to publish something in JAMA, I recommend you review the publicly available information about device evaluation. This is an idea that is appreciated by some of the folks at the BI as they are authors of some of these papers. So I'm still working on my JAMA publication from public information. Okay, so I've argued that the regulatory system favors innovation at the expense of safety. But with my devil's advocate hat still on, I'm going to argue the opposite, that the balance has shifted too far in favor of safety and that innovation is being suppressed. An example of that, the transcatheter aortic valve, which was available in Europe in 2007. 4 years before it was available in the United States, and even then only for the highest risk inoperable patients. So I don't know how busy your TAVR program is. If it's anything like ours, then it is very busy. I imagine it is at least as busy, if not more. And so you can imagine the number of patients that could have been helped by a TAVR between the years of 2007 and 2011 is a pretty tremendous opportunity cost. And you know, was the cost really worth it? Was that delay worth it? Did we have better safety in this country with regard to TAVR than they did in Europe? I think it's challenging to argue that we did. Another example, the left atrial appendage closure device, the Watchman device in particular, which was available commercially in Europe in 2005. And 2005 was the year that Katrina hit New Orleans. And I don't know about you, but that seems like ages and ages ago. It wasn't until 4 years later that it was even brought to the FDA Circulatory Systems Panel. The Circulatory Systems Panel is a group of experts that are external to the FDA that evaluate the data supporting safety and effectiveness for typically very novel devices, first-in-class devices. And this group of experts make recommendations to the FDA, but certainly don't have any power to either approve or not approve a device. Bringing a device to panel, as it's called, is a tremendous effort by both industry and FDA. So it is really not a small task to convene a panel. In this case, the 2009 panel simply wasn't enough, and there were 2 additional panels convened for the same device in 2013 and 2014 to review additional data. And the device wasn't approved till the year of Deflategate in 2015. And it was approved with a really broad label. And in fact, the data that supported the approval in 2015 were still largely based on the early studies of Watchman. And at the time of early study of Watchman, there were many differences in the way we manage atrial fibrillation with regard to anticoagulation, the way it's ablated, other left atrial appendage occlusion systems. So one could argue that it took so long for the device to make it through panel and make it to market that the data supporting it were essentially obsolete, or certainly it was more difficult to understand how to apply this device when the data supporting it were so outdated. So in this case, you can argue that that earlier to market would have allowed us to better understand how the device can be used in the context of all of our other tools. And one other example of how medical device innovation is potentially suppressed in this country is through the prism of early feasibility study. It's long been recognized that when devices are studied through early, first in human and early feasibility studied in a certain geographic location, that tends to be the same place that clinical trials are conducted, and when clinical trials are conducted, that tends to be the same place that they become available for commercial use. So there is a tremendous effort for this reason and for others, both also for ethical reasons, to bring early feasibility study back to this country. When the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, which is a group of regulators and industry and other stakeholders, when they surveyed their industry partners about the reasons why early feasibility studies are largely not conducted in this country in 2015 anyway, far and away most common answer was regulatory challenges, that these were felt to be too great to support the early feasibility study of devices in this country. And then 2017, the MDIC performed another analysis in which they measured the components of delay. And so for an early medical device company, every day that a device is not being implanted or paid for is lost money. And if that delay is long enough, the company can no longer exist, and we lose out on whatever innovative device that company was developing. And you can see on the right-hand bar graph that IDE approval, which reflects the time it takes to make it through for FDA to evaluate a planned study, is actually not the greatest delay in getting new devices implanted or studied. That it's really at the site level through contract approval and subject enrollment that is the major delay. But as I mentioned, any delay is an opportunity for that medical device company not to make it. And of course, this doesn't even bring up what goes in before you even get to IDE approval, but preclinical testing and fundraising and everything else that goes into developing a device and getting it ready for clinical trials. This is a really long pipeline and with many bottlenecks along the way. And so one could argue that these bottlenecks intended to protect safety are actually suppressing innovation. There are a number of attempts to try and clear these bottlenecks, some of them by the FDA, of which I am aware. And on the left-hand side is a screenshot of the guidance document for early feasibility study in the US. This is an attempt by FDA to provide guidance so that to bring companies to the table early to talk about early feasibility and to provide some guidance on how to do that with minimal amounts of delay. In addition, breakthrough devices, which I've mentioned a couple of times, are devices that are intended or designed for patients with few alternatives and serious life-threatening diseases, where the threshold for least burdensome approach can be lowered in some cases in order to get these devices through regulatory evaluation more quickly. And of course, 21st century cures, which I've mentioned already at least once or twice, and this provides opportunity to use alternative sources of data and alternative evaluation mechanisms, especially in the case of life-threatening illness for which there are few alternatives. So perhaps these, among others, can clear out these bottlenecks along the way. And I realize this may seem like a tangent, but I think it's closely related. So the patient voice is historically absent from this discussion about balancing safety and innovation. And I believe that privacy plays a really important role in this balance because if we, every time we enroll a patient in a clinical trial, we are asking them to trust us with their privacy. And if we propose to continue to surveil medical devices long after they are approved and implanted or used, then we are asking patients for further access or put their privacy at greater risk. Up until a few years ago, patients were never really asked in any systematic way about this until the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee was initially created in 2017. And last year, this group met to talk about cybersecurity in particular, which I think is so fascinating as an electrophysiologist in particular, with implanted devices where we have opportunity to amass tremendous amounts of data from these patients. And cybersecurity risks are real. And so asking patients how they perceive these risks, how they want to be informed about risks was, I think, a step in the right direction. There is a summary of the transcript of this meeting, and if you're interested, it is just a few pages long, and it's really interesting. I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear that the patients decided there was no one-size-fits-all approach, and that the particulars of a device or the underlying condition play a big role in how communication should be made between patients and providers and regulators with regard to risk. And what I thought was really interesting was this quote that this patient group was clear that they wanted messages conveyed through a variety of means, emails and web posting, social media, etc. And this is really different from how we typically interact with our patients. We typically do this in face-to-face visits or virtual visits these days, which is, I think, not exactly how patients always want to be communicated with. This is a this is a topic for a whole other grand rounds, and it's one that I'm exploring actively now, and I find it really interesting how to incorporate patients into this discussion. But I think the bottom line is that we can have safety and innovation simultaneously. So I've taken my devil's advocate hat off, and now I'm a mediator, and I think we can have both of these things. We can have our cake and eat it too, and I'll tell you why I think that. So through these two mechanisms, I've hinted at this along the way, that if we continue to collect data if we collect data before a device is approved and then continue to collect data in a systematic way after the device is approved, then we can learn important things about the device and make changes to how the device is made or how it's regulated along the way, as long as we have real-time, efficient, and robust ways to collect those data. And these days, with the use of real-world evidence, that might be easier than ever. That with the repurposing of clinical data that are already collected for a variety of reasons, that we may be able to continue to surveil medical devices in an unobtrusive way that can be embedded in existing workflows. One way, so we're surrounded by these data. And there are so many sources of these data. I've listed a few here in this ocean of data. Some of these have been explored already and are quite mature in their ability to provide useful post-market information, and others are more pipe dreams, but I think it's possible that depending on the question to be asked, that we should be creative in our use of existing data systems. One way that this has been done in the past, somewhat successfully, is through clinical registries. And one of the most well-known clinical registry suites is the National Cardiovascular Data Registry Suite, NCDR, which is primarily a device-based research registry that I suspect nearly everybody who's listening right now is aware of. And the NCDR ICD registry in particular was established in response to a requirement by Medicare that systematic data collection be performed with implantation of primary prevention ICDs. And the requirement was established in 2005, and based on that, there was near universal participation in the ICD registry, which collects clinical data at the time of device implant. And more broadly speaking, the coverage with evidence development, which was the mechanism by which Medicare can do this, has largely been used in cardiovascular therapies. In the bar graph on the bottom right, you can see that cardiology is the most commonly used area for this mechanism. And within these 9 examples of coverage with evidence development, 4 of them have had their evidence development requirement retired, meaning they have answered the questions that were remaining in the minds of the payer, and they no longer are required to collect these data. So the NCDR ICD registry in particular has been considered as a possible source of clinical data to continue to surveil devices in the post-market setting. And this has been done a couple of different ways that I'm aware of, and perhaps others. On the left-hand side of the screen is a graph generated by Fred Resnick and his group as part of a demonstration project. In this analysis, Dr. Resnick's group used a software algorithm embedded into the NCDR ICD registry, and on a regular basis isolated each ICD lead model and compared its performance to a combination of all the other lead models to look for signal of lead failure that fell outside of the predicted range. Thankfully, that wasn't seen, but it's an interesting idea to use the ICD registry for post-market surveillance. Again, this was never intended as a purpose for the ICD registry, but the idea is, could this potentially serve as a canary in the coal mine in finding device failure? And then in another way, a different way, along with some colleagues, we, some of which are at the Smith Center, we identified generators that were recalled by the FDA in the ICD registry, and identified the reason for recall as indicated by the FDA, and then compared that to the operator reported mode of failure. So when these recall generators failed, the operator has to report the type of failure that occurred. So we compared those to the type of failure that would be predicted by the FDA's recall, and found that agreement was quite poor at only 42%. So I think this is really mixed results, whether or not these registries can be repurposed for device surveillance. That, you know, as one of my mentors likes to say, that the devil's in the details, and it's all about getting the question right and finding a data source that's fit to that purpose. So what about claims data? This is an idea that is based on the current requirement for lead surveillance after approval by the FDA, that it's required that at least at the moment, a 5,000 person 5-year study be conducted for every new lead. And these trials are historically performed in traditional clinical trial format, again with CRFs and clinical trial visits. And these are very expensive, and the infrastructure for each of these is built up and broken down over and over again, and it seems like a waste of resources. And it's not even clear that these types of evaluations can answer the real questions. My friend at the FDA, Brian Lewis, has used this metaphor that it's the bathtub problem. And the bathtub problem is that very early on, we can see acute failures in a study like this, a 5,000 person 5-year study. We'll know a lot about how these devices fail early on, but what happens at the end of life or near the end of life? We don't know what happens then, and we don't even know how long to watch for it. You know, many ICD leads last 20, 30 years, and we certainly can't ask industry to conduct a clinical trial for that long. So the idea is that more stable data sources that are being generated for other purposes could help us answer these long-term questions. And this is the idea, again, behind EP Passion. EP Passion is born out of a program called the Predictable and Sustainable Implementation of National Cardiovascular Registries. And somehow Passion comes out of that. And this has been applied in various areas of cardiology, the valve space, the peripheral vascular space, and EP. And actually in the EP space, we've had multiple years of work put into using alternative data sources to monitor for lead survival, and ultimately have taken away the registry component of this and are instead using claims data. The idea is using claims data to identify a signal for unexpected levels of lead failure that would then trigger a deeper dive into the really rich data sources that are owned and maintained by the manufacturers themselves through remote monitoring and other sources. The really wonderful part of this is that all the manufacturers are at the table, so there is a lot of great discussion and collaboration in a non-competitive way that will benefit everyone. And a metaphor that I like is that if you build the stadium, in this case a football stadium, you can play any sport there. You just have to build a flexible stadium that can accommodate lots of different games. And so the idea here is to come up with an infrastructure for the device evaluation that is, you know, device agnostic and allows for surveillance over the long term for devices that we can't even imagine yet. So that was a long journey, but I want to bring us back to this patient, the 65-year-old with these non-functional leads. I mean, the first thing we would do, because she's right in front of you, is counsel the patient on options for lead management. And this happens to be another passion of mine. So have me back another time and I'll talk forever about lead management. But really the interesting part in her case, I think, based on what we've talked about this morning, is all the different sources of data that were potentially missed opportunities in her case. One could have submitted a MAUDE report, which I didn't even talk about this morning. Stands for Manufacturer and User Facility Device Experience, I think. It's a voluntary reporting system for device failures, or voluntary for operators anyway. So if this patient were in front of you, you might want to submit a MAUDE report. You may enroll this patient in an IDE trial or a post-market surveillance study. If you're putting in a new lead, the manufacturer may want you to enroll the patient in one of those studies. You have all this electrical and event information from the generator that's been implanted in her chest, and those data have been transmitted to a server. And perhaps we could be mining those servers for signals of lead failure well before she presented with this problem. If you decide to put in a new lead or take out an old one or both, then you may wish to enter data in the NCDR ICD registry. This is no longer required by Medicare, but some institutions continue to do that. My institution has decided not to, but others continue to contribute to this registry. You may have a clinical institutional registry for your lead management program like we do at my institution, and so data would be entered there. And then no matter what you do, you're going to be generating claims. And so those claims might become part of some long-term analysis performed by an outcomes researcher someday using claims data, or perhaps by the consortium of stakeholders seeking to provide device surveillance in an alternative way, like the EP Passion Group. So the key points, I think, is that, the idea of fostering innovation can feel in conflict with the assurance of safety at times. But I think with the right infrastructure and the right repurposing of existing data, these two ideas really do not have to be in conflict. And that we do have the tools now to do that. And I also believe that the patient voice could be a powerful part of that journey, moving from where we are now to a place where we have real-time, robust monitoring of devices in clinical practice. And we have a lot of work to get there, but there are a lot of efforts underway to achieve that. There's ongoing exploration about how to do this from a methodological and logistical standpoint. And patients and patient groups are being engaged in this process like never before, which will improve the conclusion we arrive at, I'm certain. And that this ongoing collaboration among all stakeholders is likely to result in a system that fosters innovation and protects our safety. So it's not intersection at all. It's more like a straight path, maybe not straight, but one path nonetheless, like 89 between Boston and New Hampshire, which I've traveled many times. I'm looking forward to when it looks like this. Although last time I traveled it, one of these was in my way. So hopefully you don't encounter that either on your drives or in your clinical practice. And I will stop there. I hope that there are some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was a fantastic talk, a real tour de force. I know we have a couple of folks eagerly waiting to ask you questions, so please feel free to come off mute and ask Emily, or for folks who have questions they'd like to submit via chat, I can certainly read those.
I have a question, Peter. Emily, great talk. Thanks very much for doing this lecture this morning. I think that the Watchman and the whole idea of left atrial appendage isolation is a pretty interesting one from a regulatory perspective. I don't think it's that analogous to TAVR because, with TAVR we had we knew that the concept was good, at least that there was a surgery that worked and that this should work. We never had that experience. We could have had it with left atrial appendage occlusion had we done this surgically, or at least acquired that data prospectively. I think we would have had an answer as to whether or not this was a valuable approach, and we ended up with this really kind of, to me, very haphazard, not terribly well done approach to to approving this device in a very broad way. And we continue to get registry data out of that is focused mostly on safety at this point, but I'm not sure we really had the efficacy answer that we should have had before approving that that device. And we've had certainly some failures with the Lariat in terms of major complications with devices that sounded good, but have had major challenges. What's your sense of where we're headed with that?
That's a great point. I think the Watchman experience is like a talk in itself. It's such an interesting regulatory journey for that device. I agree with you totally that our current system is devised to, if we're capturing any post-market data, it's safety data. And I think there was a real missed opportunity to collect effectiveness data with that device in particular. And I think, the moment is probably past to get really rigorous effectiveness data for Watchman. We'll get post hoc retrospective, well, not retro. I mean, it's prospectively collected from the registry, but it's not randomized data that like we could have had pre-market. So, and I agree that when the stakes are quite different with Watchman, because you're not typically talking about life and death like you are with TAVR. So I can't say that I totally understand how we ended up where we are with Watchman. And I think that the clinical use of that device reflects that it is used so variably from institution to institution. And I'm hopeful that with the registry, we're starting to see some data from that registry. I'm hopeful that we can sort of eke out some more effectiveness data, especially in the era of modern anticoagulation and modern ablation and modern antiarrhythmics, none of which were available when it was studied. So I totally agree with you. I think it is a bit of a confusing journey for that device.
I mean, I can add one other historical sort of funny point to this that demonstrates the evolution in our subspecialties in cardiology. When Mike Lesh developed the Plato device in the mid 1990s, he actually brought it to CDAC, which was the predecessor to HCRI and BAME, and we did a power calculation for what would be needed to demonstrate at least equivalence, and it was a number that was far exceeded anything that's come up for any other Watchman series. And EV3 ended up not being able to do that trial. The initial trials with Plato were all run by design interventional cardiology practices. So Mark Reisman at Swedish was the PI for those initial trials. They specifically minimize the number of EP sites, even though Mike Lesh was an electrophysiologist, because the feeling was that the EP physicians would be too conservative about using it in the absence of any strong evidence base. And we've now come, I would argue, to a place where the electrophysiologists are far more apt to begin to use technologies with very little evidence base, maybe even more aggressively than the interventional cardiologists.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I think, and there's many examples of that. I've been often spoken with colleagues. I think his bundle pacing is a nice example of that. I'm concerned we may never see, really randomized clinical data for his bundle pacing.
Right. Absolutely.
We lose equipoise, and we have a missed opportunity. If we had robust data collection systems, we might, be okay, but we don't.
Yeah, you're right.
Emily, this is Dwayne Pinto. I have a question about an intersection later on in the life cycle of a device, which is the policy separation between CMS and FDA. And often there's a bottleneck in uptake and utilization, because it's almost like there's a firewall of data, of separation of data of, it's approved by the FDA, but is CMS going to cover it? And examples where that has, changed the adoption of technology include, carotid stenting. Wondered what you thought about that. Obviously, we're not going to change, United States policy, but, other countries have handled it differently.
That's a fantastic point. And it's one I'm really fascinated by right now. I actually have a analysis under review looking at that exact thing. I mean, I think the coverage with evidence development embodies that conflict, that the data that are adequate for FDA somehow are inadequate for payers, and they still consider something potentially experimental when the FDA has said that it's not, that it is safe and effective. And the regulatory discontinuity is really frustrating. And I think that it's pretty clear that the tides have shifted, and I think many device manufacturers would agree with you that at this point it's the payers that pose the greatest obstacle to getting a device to market and paid for. And there have been efforts actually for a long time to conduct what's called parallel review between CMS and FDA, and I don't know a whole lot about it other than it's not been particularly successful, and there are very few examples of when that has worked well. And I'm not sure if it is simply an issue with the regulatory threshold is different for CMS as it is for FDA, but certainly there's opportunity to do a better job there. CMS is kind of like a couple decades behind where FDA is, and they're starting to ask people to come to the table early on to talk about how to get devices covered when they hit the market, but I don't know that it's been as successful. I think in part they're under-resourced compared to the FDA and don't have the manpower to do that in an effective and efficient way. But I think at the moment, coverage of evidence development is one of the only mechanisms to do that, but there are some major problems there as well, which you're probably aware of, with lack of transparency and lack of consistency in how that program has been executed.
So Emily, this is Jeff Popma. I got to say, that was an absolutely brilliant presentation. I've been doing this for 15, 20 years, and you have concisely summarized very quickly the challenges that we've had on both demonstrating a reasonable assurance of safety and efficacy. It was just absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to see if I can get your slides. They're absolutely.
Absolutely.
Listen, I've got one comment and one question for you. The first comment is that you were spot on with your statements about how in 2007, 2010 or so, there was a delay in getting CoreValve into the United States in clinical trials. And it was completely because we were caught up in having to demonstrate repetitive cycle testing that nitinol was stable. And we had to prove that the valve on that structure was stable. So although we had a randomized trial ready to go in 2007, we actually didn't, and there was a transition to Medtronic, but we actually didn't get the trial going for almost 3 years later. And CoreValve worked great then. And so you're absolutely correct, but it was at that preclinical side. And in EFS pathway that Andy put together, Andy Farb, that would have fixed that, right? Because we could have done an early feasibility study and gotten into patients in 2009 and not 2011. So I think you're spot on with that. Let me ask you a more practical problem right now that I think we're having is that when John Lastinger was with the FDA, he really had that real world evidence gig going, right? It was I'll get real world evidence. And as we have seen some of the more recent publications about the left ventricular assist devices with Impella coming out of both the Premier database and out of NCDR. And we had the paclitaxel problem where we had randomized trials, but not that great data. I kind of get the sense that the FDA is going back to needing to go back to fundamental blocking and tackling and not necessarily relying upon really cool designs for registry because we're making progress with that. And I wonder if you didn't really talk much about surrogate endpoints, but like for mitral regurgitation, people that just showing that the mitral regurgitation is reduced, right? Do you think that there's going to be a role rather than pushing towards real world evidence that we actually get into some more randomized trials, but with more surrogate endpoints that'll give us some more clarity about how the patients are going to do?
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And to be succinct, yes, I think that is happening. So for example, especially in the breakthrough devices or the expedited access pathway, there have been some examples of devices that have been approved based on surrogate endpoints. So the CVRX's, their barostim activation therapy treatment was approved fully based on surrogate endpoints. Yeah. And so I think you're right. They're learning about real world evidence as they go. They're flying the plane as they build it. And I think there's going to be some back and forth. I think it's commendable to even try, but you're right. There have been some failures, but I think that the issue is having the systems in place to collect those data, and know, so that you can go back and examine things and follow it.
Postmarket, yeah.
And I think really what is implied by all this, but I didn't actually say it. What's implied is that we have to be willing that or understand that we'll get it wrong sometimes, and stuff will make it to market that will then have to come off the market. And right now that's like a huge deal, but I think if we can accept that, and I think this is where the patient voice is really important. We have to know, are they willing to endure that? And if they are, then, and we can accept that, then it opens up a new paradigm.
Yeah, thanks. Really great talk, Emily. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much.
We'll take one final question from Robert Gersten, and then I'll, at the very end, summarize the ongoing discussion on the chat.
Emily, that was a great talk. Just a very quick question. It wasn't surprising in one of your bar graphs how much IRB approval and local, kind of agreements, legal agreements delayed these various processes. Can you speak a little bit about centralization of IRBs, master agreements that might, make individual institutions accept things a little bit more, but at the same time, if there's verbiage that might, mitigate some of their downstream legal concerns, there's, more centralization of that process that might be done at a couple of the lead academic centers. Has that helped or not? How much has that helped?
I'm not aware that that's been done in like early feasibility study. Certainly there is a lot of energy around that at levels way above my pay grade, at the NIH and other places that have been effective, for example, for large pragmatic trials. But I'm not aware that's happened in early feasibility study. I think this is one of the reasons that stuff gets moved outside the US, or I know it's one of the reasons, certainly one of the reasons that industry suggested. And I don't know, at your institution, do you tell me, have you experienced early feasibility groups wanting to centralize their IRB? I don't know.
This isn't exactly my area. I mean, I've seen it in some other sort of other types of interventions that we've been involved in, where there was central groups that were working on this, but it seemed like things still got hung up at each institution that wanted to dot an I differently or cross a different T, or so I was just wondering if
early feasibility tends to be, or at least that I'm aware of, tends to be at one or two places, and so I don't know what the I guess if you were thinking you might scale an early feasibility study into an IDE study,
right,
then it might be useful, but that certainly could be true. I'm not aware of it.
Okay.
Great. So given the hour, I'll just quickly summarize the ongoing chat comments. So from Dr. Warren Manning, it would seem that from a society safety efficacy perspective, there is rationale and justification to monitor all devices for the length of the implantation. Why isn't this simply standard? Is it simply cost? And then a follow-up comment, the use of surrogate endpoints for FDA approval would seem to emphasize the need for ongoing long-term surveillance to demonstrate efficacy for hard endpoints. And a comment from one of our fellows, Kay Everett, there is also little incentivization of companies to perform surveillance studies, which are widely disseminated. So Emily, if you have any parting thoughts on those comments.
I mean, all really good comments. This is the stuff that keeps me up at night, and I love this stuff. So those folks, write down my email address and send me a line. But I think we do have a compelling reason to want to monitor devices forever, and I think that cost plays a huge role in that. But also, who owns those data? Where do they live? I mean, these are practical problems that are related to cost. But and then I think this issue that we were talking about a moment ago, about willingness to sort of take a device off the market, that is an incredibly monumental event to happen. And I think until we have the appetite for that, it's sort of hard to accept incomplete safety data at the time of approval. The incentive issue is a really important one, and if we can get devices to market earlier based on less complete information, with the understanding that the data will continue to be collected post-market, then I think there is an incentive for industry to continue to surveil devices. or they can be compelled to by either payers or regulators, FDA, in order to continue to have their device be commercially available. So I think we can align the incentives. We're not there yet, at least not universally, but in some cases we are able to align them appropriately in order to continue to collect the right information post-market.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for joining us for this virtual Grand Rounds. We certainly hope to have you in person very soon. So a huge thank you, and we'll see everyone next week for Grand Rounds.
Thanks, Arthi. Thanks so much for having me. It was really a delight. Thank you.